All right, well, let's get underway. This is Doug Cogswell here from Advisor. I'm in a room with Margot.
Hello.
And Mateo.
Hi, everyone.
And we're going to talk about stopping the complexity creep, how to keep things simple. And this kind of came up by popular demand. We had another number of clients is talking about this, so we figured we'd kind of do a roundtable on it and open this up to discussion. So as we get into this, if you want to jump in the dialogue, there is a capability to raise your hand over on the go to webinar. The blue box here describes on the right. And if you raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can jump in the discussion with us. Or you can just type a question in the question box at the bottom and we'll pick you up and we'll talk it through. So we want this to be kind of just a discussion and get a bunch of perspective on this. And we've got one page, that's it. So those of you who know me, this is unusual. Usually I have like lots of pages, but this is literally the one page we're going to talk from. And we wanted to start by things that are important when building a project. And we kind of, on the whiteboard in here, outlined 4 of them. Defining the scope properly, multiple small projects could be better, managing to the scope and designing the project well, and we'll go through each of those. Then after it's deployed, and we've seen unfortunate cases where something that was designed pretty simpler kind of grows over time. You know, Joe manages it. So Margot comes into Joe and says, I want to add this, and then Mateo comes in and I want to add this, and Sue comes in, and pretty soon what had been a focused project becomes overwhelming for many of the end users. So we want to talk about that as well. Just the lineup, and seriously, at any time, if you want to jump in the discussion, I'm going to sort by the raised hand. Raise your hand, and we'll have you come in. So we're going to take these in turn and just sort of internally here have a discussion. So defining the scope up front, you know, and when advisors working on a project in the sales process, we try to work with our clients to clearly detail a problem, because a well-designed project solves a problem, and it's designed around key questions that the team's trying to answer. And where we've seen these go off track is, you know, we start with prospect identification, or we start with like a major giving staff metrics project, and then it's, well, let's put some more pages in because we really want to also be able to do this. And that is where the scope starts getting too broad, and it can be then overwhelming to people. I was actually at a meeting yesterday where this had happened. So very strongly up front, the concept is this ought to solve a problem, and there ought to be a set of key questions that can be laid on the table that people actually want to use it to solve. Now I'm going to talk to the next one and then pass it over. I think Margot is going to jump into managing the scope. But the second point is, and I love this, this is, I think, Mark, I think you're on the call. Mark Sanders from Georgia Tech at Lucy and Live talked about multiple small projects may be better than the one big project. And I know Art Held from University of Montana laid the same concept out last year at our user group. And so Mark was talking about, you know, some of his projects are as focused as, you know, engineering prospects in Georgia, or why are my alumni in the where are my alumni in the U.S. for one of my units? And, you know, Art had something on, you know, the call center program for an end-of-the-year campaign, or he had something on a set of prospects for the forestry school. So that's worth thinking about that. You know, it's tempting to have these mega projects, but if the end users get overwhelmed and confused by it, the complexity gets in the way of usability. Margo, why don't you talk a little bit? So you got to get the scope.
Right.
And then, like, how do we, because we end up here in these projects where.
Right. And just one more note on the multiple small projects. Advisor makes it really easy to pull data quickly from your database. So small projects can, you know, can be really powerful and not take a lot of time to create. So I think there's a lot of value in having multiple small projects. But talking more about managing the scope, so I know, you know, at the beginning of the project, you define the scope, pick a problem you're going to solve, and the questions you want to answer. But lots of times when you're actually in the middle of the build, you know, you're focusing on your data, and if you're seeing it for the first time, it's exciting, and you kind of forget about the scope and what the key questions you're trying to answer. And so, I mean, from my experience, there's lots of times where clients get excited, and they're like, well, I also want to see this data, this might help. But what you really, it's really easy to get distracted from the main problem you're trying to answer, but every time that you think of something that you didn't initially think of that you wanted in the project during the build, you should stop and just really think, do I really need this to answer the questions that we're trying to answer? Or is this something that might help but not really, but it might help to answer a different question? So then that, save for another project. So you just got to constantly go back and really think about the problem that you're trying to solve and the questions to answer. Yeah, and you can always take stuff out and add stuff in later if you realize that you really do need it. So less is better starting out with, I'd say.
And have you had, Margaret, I think you've actually had some projects where you made them, so they got overwhelming, and you ended up cutting them back. So how did that go?
Yeah, there's been a few of those, and stuff just keeps getting added to the project, and then eventually, when clients try and roll it out to the broader, to the more broad audience, the audience comes back and says, this is way too overwhelming. I don't know where to go to find this piece of information. I don't know if I should go to this page or this page because they sound similar, and it's just way too overwhelming, and then it deters people from using the project because they think it's just too complicated and confusing and they can't answer the questions. So whenever this does happen, we always have to cut back the project. So.
Yeah, I was at one yesterday where I was with the AVP of Major Giving. He leads the Major Giving team, and it was one of these where it had just a lot of pages, which was great for the prospect research team. But he said, Doug, this is just too much for me. I get lost in it. And so we're going to work to create a 4-page project. One's going to be on assignments. There's going to be one on contacts. And very simple charts on the page. It's the key information. It's interactive. You can drill into it. And then the 3rd page is moves, and the 4th page is solicitations. And it's going to be just 4 simple pages, but he can cross-cut it and see somebody's getting a lot of visits, but boy, they're running really low on solicitations. They're getting hung in some of the move stages. So just fresh off the plate conversation. Mateo, why don't you just jump in a little bit about a well-designed project? So obviously that's part of it too. You can get the scope and everything, but how these things get put together really does matter.
Yeah, another problem with complexity is sometimes authors who are more familiar with the software would tend just to, again, get excited and try to show as much of the data as possible. So one thing that's a little tricky, but you should always try to do as an author is to keep the end user in mind, trying to put yourself in the shoes of the end user. And then that translates to the next point where you want to have the right number of pages, group them well. You want to have the right type of charts too. So we've seen that there's different ways in which people respond to information. Some people are more visual than others. Some others prefer numbers. Most people like a mix of both. So when we are designing a project, that's why we have reviews and the consultative process, because we want to make sure that the project is, 1, easy to go through the different pages and groupings, and 2, it makes sense to the end user. And another thing is that really advisor can be used at all levels in an organization, but a project should be tweaked for the right level. So if you're working on an executive dashboard, they probably just care about a few key metrics versus if the project is getting rolled to a very technical team, then they will be able to manage a lot of information. Another key recommendation that we always have is do not repeat content. So you don't want to have the same bar chart over and over in different pages necessarily. 1, because it just occupies the space, and then people get confused on where to select What does help, though, is to keep in the different pages accounts chart and some sort of list or summary sheet that has some key information so that the user knows where they are in the data, how many people they have selected, what they are looking at.
Yeah, I saw one here where geography was split into different parts of the project. So we like to have, the pages in groupings. So there's themes around the groupings, and then the pages are issues within the group. I think what had happened here was there was a group on alumni, there was another group on friends. So we took entities and was broken into these different groups. And then geography was in multiple areas. And it got, but the problem was some of the entities were both. So there were alumni who were also parents, and some of them were also friends. And the geography got really confusing as to how many people actually were in an area when you looked at a map, for example. And what should have happened there is should have been one page on geography. Then you could have selected, if you wanted alumni, you could get the alumni on the map, and you'd have the right unit counts. So those kinds of things. You can see why it was done one way, but it needs to be thought through, because if people are seeing something that should be all in one place in multiple places, it's like, okay, this doesn't quite align with this. What's different with it? Why is it over here? And then they're trying to compare them, and they don't quite line up, and they don't understand. So that's a good point about don't repeat content. Put it in clear, themed page groupings that are the user's mindset for navigation.
Right, and another good point that goes along with that is also you want to be very descriptive with the name of your pages. Try to use the best you can the labels in the charts, obviously the navigation panes to help end users follow through the project.
So I'm going to edit this on the fly because he just added some good points here. So do some real-time editing. Keep going.
Yeah, so then I guess a key recommendation is when in doubt, keep it simple. If you have a way to get to an answer already, there's really no point on adding something else because that just creates clutter in the project. And last, another recommendation, or it's more of a thing up to discretion, but I do recommend considering this, is we have the filters that can be set up based on a Credential logon system so that people have access to different parts of the data. In that way, you can help by giving different people access to different parts of the data, and this can make the analysis easier because you don't have to repeat the same filtering every time that you log into the project. So if some teams just always look, for example, just alumni, then as an author, set that up, and then they wouldn't have to do that filtering every single time. So there's that option too.
Yeah, I know we've had, most of our clients have not used the credential-based filtering, and we've often had discussions, and the argument has been we'd like everybody to see the pool, the context of where they fit. So they actually want people to see the whole pool and then consciously drop it just themselves. The counter that is we're finding, and it depends on who the people are, but there's been a number of cases where people aren't particularly computer savvy and aren't particularly data savvy, and that can actually be confusing. Why do I see all this other stuff? So, we've now been using credential-based filters more, and you actually may think about varying this by the characteristics or the caliber of the users to consume information, because there's arguments both ways. Not to put so the credential-based filters, when Mateo logs in, it can drop the project, so Mateo is just seeing his portfolio. Or Margot comes in, same project, she just sees her portfolio, versus Mateo comes in, sees the whole portfolio, he needs maybe to click on a text filter to drop it to his. That's the trade-off there. And I know there's two sides to it, but in terms of the simplicity, obviously makes it simpler.
Yeah, and I just want to one thing that I would strongly recommend, if you can, is that what will make the project design go smoothly and most likely meet the end user's needs is to have internal reviews for like how we do a project build. I think if you have the capability to have meetings in person with the end users and the authors, that would really help clear up any confusion or any doubts that the author might have. So I think that would be the best thing to do.
And actually, a question just came in. Would we consider doing a webinar on how to implement credential-based filtering? Yeah, let's note that. We will. That's a very good idea. We can take you through conceptually, what it does, and then show you how to implement it. And that works on the web deployment. Obviously, the client is a client app, but the web deployment, either coming in off iPads or browsers, has that capability. So good. So then the next area is after it's deployed. So we kind of go to building one of these, and then we've seen them. It's like the third law of physics, where things move to entropy, greater levels of randomness. While projects tend to evolve to greater levels of complexity, they rarely on their own come to greater levels of simplicity. And kind of the first thing is, and I think all of our clients do this pretty well, but you want, if it's a production project, one owner who vets all the changes. The last thing you want is multiple people having access to the master project, and then you come in the morning, it got changed by who? What happened here? And so this project owner can then digest the requests and then do what's appropriate. Which Margaret, you're going to then jump in on some of this.
Right. So yeah, lots of times after a project's deployed by Advisor, people realize they want to see something a little differently or add some data, and lots of times this ends up being out of scope, and it's really only going to help the person that requests it. So I think the owner of the project should decide if this is out of the scope of what the project is, what the problem the project is supposed to answer or fix, and then if it's out of scope, strongly consider a new project. So if it's not going to really answer the key questions of the scope of the current project, then you might just want to build a whole new project to answer these questions. And it can be a small project. You can just load in whatever data that they want to see and make a small project on the side for them. It's, like I said before, it's really easy to just build a quick, simple project in Advisor. And so if the owner isn't quite sure if it's in the scope of the project or not, it might be helpful just to get input from all the end users. Maybe just send out an email saying, we're thinking of adding this, what do you guys think? I feel like that would help get some discussion going and really flesh out whether or not it's worth adding it or not.
I think, Mateo, you made a point earlier, too, that often the project owner and the authors tend to be more technical or data-savvy people. And if that's the case, they have to intentionally make sure to keep the end-user viewpoint first. Because if it's management or frontline field officers, which many of the end users are, they can get overwhelmed by something that the author thinks is really simple, easy, and maybe too much for them. So there's always like a little bit of a tension there. But just always, that's why the last point, keep the end user viewpoint first. They're the ones that, because what we obviously want, and you want, is people to use it and use it daily and get benefit from it. And when we see that is not happening, and in some cases because of increasing complexity, it's okay, like how did we get here? And it's sort of, we pooled our wisdom, and it's these kinds of things is what we've seen. And obviously we also, we're trying to help you all get something when we're working with a team in that's most effective and going to be widely used, but we also can get pulled off, of course, because we're often working with the more technical, savvy, data-centric people on the team. So we're constantly trying to make sure we get the balance right, but we're not perfect either. So this is, I think, general rules for everybody just to keep in mind. And thank you for your time. And good luck with managing the complexity creep and keeping things simple. Thanks a lot. Take care.